For me, we had an awesome panel yesterday. They set the bar pretty high, so our panel this morning, I'm sure will live up to expectations. What we're really focused on now is future innovations that will impact our industry. And so the 4 panelists that we have, the idea here is that they can start hopefully forecasting. They can see murmurs and trends and things that are currently happening that will pay big dividends, or where our industry will ultimately go in 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years. And so we're really fortunate today to have 4 high-profile leaders from our industry to share their insights. We also have Gretchen Gagel from Continuum Advisory Group, who's their president and a co-founder of their company that's going to serve as our moderator this morning. The first person is Filipe Barbosa. He's a senior partner with McKinsey. He's one of their top executives. He's the firm's co-leader of the capital projects and infrastructure practice, and he was one of the firm's founders on capital productivity and mega projects. He has a PhD in aeronautical engineering, and I'm a pilot, so I'm going to have an interesting conversation with him later. PhD in aeronautical engineering from the University of the Witwatersrand called Veatch in South Africa. We have Manish Chawla. He's at IBM. He's their global lead for manufacturing and resources, construction and industrial machinery. Manish earned an MBA in Information Systems and Operations Management at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. Greg Bentley is the CEO of Bentley Systems. They're a software company that serves the building, plant, civil, geospatial markets in the area of architecture, engineering, construction, and operations. Previously, Greg founded a software trading firm, which became part of SunGard Data Systems, and he holds an MBA in finance and decision sciences from Wharton. Steve Edwards is the current CEO of Black & Veatch. His career with the company spans nearly 4 decades, and he has overall responsibility for the company's engineering, consulting, construction, and related infrastructure businesses in energy, water, telecommunications, and security markets worldwide. He has a degree in electrical engineering from the University of Missouri. So with that, I'd invite Gretchen and the 4 panelists to come on stage and share their insights in terms of the future innovations that are going to impact our industry. Thanks.
Good morning. Wow, Stephen, that was pretty provocative. I'll give you an A+ on provocative. Welcome to our panelists. We're going to start by having each of the panelists give us a little bit of a background about themselves and their company. Then we'll move into some questions around innovation, disruption, and transformation, which I'm sure will be interesting. And I think we're going to have a little time for Q&A at the end of the session. So if you think of a question, jot it down, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So Steve, I'm going to start with you. Give us a little bit of a background about you, your company, and your thoughts on innovation.
Okay. Well, as the introduction said, I've been at Black & Veatch close to 40 years, and that seems a bit daunting now, looking back. But Black & Veatch has always found ways to change. And generally in the industry, if you don't find ways to change and innovate, then you're going to fade away or find yourself disrupted by others. So we've had a natural tendency to do that over time. And so this topic today is, of course, very, very interesting to me. And as I think about it, I believe the industry has been used to a number of long-term trends over the past decades that we've grown accustomed to dealing with. More recently, things like climate events, sustainability, maybe global population growth. Those are longer-term trends that I think we're all used to dealing with, and that requires a certain pace. It requires us to alter our solutions, alter the way that we deliver projects, but that's a pace that we can deal with. What's particularly interesting today and of great concern to me is the pace of other areas that are accelerating much faster than the long-term trends we've experienced in the past. Technology is an area that's accelerating much, much faster. I'm sure everyone has seen the curve that shows very steep adoption and changes in the technology areas. And those can have tremendous impacts on our industry. I think as of today, we have not really been disrupted by those, but it's a clear and present danger in my mind that if we don't follow that, we don't react to it, we don't innovate, we don't find ways to embrace that and find ways to invest in that today and take actions today to be ready for the future, then we will either fade away and or be disrupted by others. Those technologies have tremendous potential for our industry. Probably a number of those are familiar to you: robotics, artificial intelligence, virtual reality. A lot of what's happening out in the world, if you look at it, has direct application to our industry, but is not being applied at a pace to keep up. So one of the concerns, obviously, when we're engaged with large capital projects is we always have to deliver, we have to be dependable. So one of the issues we need to deal with as an industry is how do we experiment with new technologies, how do we introduce them, how do we make perhaps some small experiments to test those out and continually be trying those with our clients to move our industry forward. Some examples at Black & Veatch for us are we're applying some robotics techniques on one of our current construction projects in the field. We are looking at ways to bring virtual reality and augmented reality to help craft in ways where we see craft skills declining. What can we do to put information in front of them in a simple and easy way for them to be guided as they're doing their daily activities in the field? So we're working a lot on how we might build projects, but we're also innovating in the solutions that we offer. And much as Steve brought up, when he brought up the maybe move towards miniaturization, one of the disruptors that's been of concern to me is that some of the capital projects might actually get smaller. So he was discussing multiple trains of smaller size. But some of what we see is also that capital projects, they're still the very large projects, but there's also smaller projects. And most of us are used to doing the very large projects, large capital projects. That's what gets us excited when we get up every morning. But that could be a disruption for us if there's a continuing trend towards smaller projects that take on an increasing share of our market. And so we've been diligent about making sure that we're not only good at the mega projects, very large projects, but smaller capital projects. We're engaged with Tesla on charging stations. We're working on hydrogen fueling stations with Honda and Toyota. We're doing work with a lot of new technology companies, which we hope to some extent rub off on us, that we learn how they move faster. Because being a company that's 103 years old, we pull a lot of history with us, being 103 years old. And we need to find ways to be more nimble and agile in order to succeed in the future. So the other area we're addressing is the culture at the company, trying to make sure that our professionals understand that it's all right to try these small experiments. If they don't work, that's all right if it was on a small scale. The main issue is make sure that we learn something from that, and we're always out there trying to improve, trying to innovate, trying to be ahead of the curve. So I think the industry clearly has the capacity to respond to today's challenges. I think we have the capacity to innovate at a faster pace than we have in the past and meet these challenges and hopefully get ahead of those that will be coming to disrupt us. It's not if, but when that will happen, in my view.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And I'm going to come back to that point you made about culture a little later, because I think that's a really important conversation. Filipe?
Okay. So I lead our capital and infrastructure practice. I think for McKinsey, this sector of capital projects and infrastructure is one of our top 5 priorities globally. And the reason why is, firstly, it transforms society. When I compete for talent, either bringing people into our firm or within our firm to try and get folks to say, hey, this is a sector where you can make a difference. I think the tagline we use is, we're building the world, right? It's about making the world a better place. It's about delivering, to people and society what they need, be it hospitals, energy, and so forth. So fundamentally, this is a critical sector for us. The size of this sector is, incredible. It's $10 trillion a year in capital and infrastructure. And we think the opportunity within it, and I'll come back to it later, is over $1 trillion a year, right? So there's an enormous amount of waste and there's an enormous amount of opportunity. So, number one, for us, this industry is just critical, both on our social mission, but on a more business mission as well. I think the theme of innovate, disrupt, and transform is absolutely spot on, right? Every single sector we serve is being disrupted. It's phenomenal. The older disruptions are wonderful stories. I think some were mentioned up here earlier, but my 2 favorite are, our current predictions are that, fossil fuels for vehicles will reach probably peak demand in 2025. We think, oil will probably reach peak demand in about 2035. Obviously there's uncertainties here, but, chemical products, carry on carrying that. But if you think of one of the disrupting forces, which is the lithium battery, which is transforming vehicles, well, some of the first prototypes were built by ExxonMobil in the 70s, right? So, you look at the world's largest oil and gas company, they largely helped develop and invent the technology that's transforming their industry. It's an incredible example, right? The other one is obviously Kodak. Everyone knows that, right? They built the first digital camera in 1975. They had everything in their space. I remember as a young PhD student, one of our dreams was to own a Kodak Mega Plus camera when we were looking at, sort of advanced image processing and so on. And the thrill of it was 1 megapixel, and it cost about $100,000 back then, right? And you think how they transformed the industry. So we see every industry being disrupted, and within this, and I'll share some figures later, we recently did some research that we shared with you on construction productivity, but more recently, and we'll share it with this group, around technology and disruptions in this industry. And we were astounded by the facts and figures that we saw, right? Over 1,000 construction tech startups that we could identify, $10 billion of venture capital being raised in the last 5 years and accelerating. So, we do think this industry is on a brink, and we see it in our client work, right? It's a CEO-level topic now. I would say, industrial companies and owners are saying, we almost don't trust ourselves now to deliver projects on time and on budget. This is now a CEO-level question. It's a question about our fundamental ability to compete and grow. We see engineering and construction firms starting to appoint chief digital officers, chief technology officers that we didn't see before in the past. And the scale of the type of work, is incredible, right? Everything from building digital collaboration tools to using advanced analytics and machine learning at Crossrail, in London to see how tunnels are moving. So our own business has been transformed, and maybe I'll end there, but it's always good to not only talk about the industries you serve, but your own industry. We believe that, in the management consulting industry, if you can't do this at scale, you'll be dead. And we were talking about how do we transform folks outside of the engineering sector. The last 2 months, we had every single partner in McKinsey, close to 2,000, spending 2 days either in Cambridge or here in the US, learning about machine learning, digital, and so on. And, so we see the challenge in ourselves as well. So, pleasure to be here.
That's a big investment in learning. Incredible. Manish?
Certainly. Thanks, Gretchen. So I think, so firstly, just as Stephen said, I run IBM's business that focuses on the manufacturing, resources, and construction verticals. The reason we combine them together under this title of industrial products is we see a lot of value in the ecosystem. Industries transform fundamentally by collaborating with the ecosystem. And we'll come back to that as well in terms of just in terms of lessons learned that we can take from one industry to the other. And so if I look at the way IBM has transformed, and if you talk about transforming industries, right? Technology industry is one of the fastest transforming industries. IBM's point of view is in the technology industry, in the blink of an eye, right? You can pretty much become redundant, right? So contrast that to the construction industry where the cycles are much longer. However, we saw a disruptive trend several years ago, which fundamentally said that the world, and this is a known fact, that data will be the world's next natural resource, right? So our CEO said that. I believe lots of other people have now used that phrase in various forms, data is the next oil, et cetera, et cetera. So what's the essence of it? I think there's two parts to it. One is that there'll be volumes and volumes of data. Every time I present this at any conference or a client meeting, et cetera, the slide has changed because now we're using a different word before the word bytes. So I believe the current one is petabytes versus exabytes or terabytes, right? So that keeps changing. So there'll be volumes of data. The other part of it is that there's a lot of value in this data, and back to the data as the next natural resource, and I'll come back to that in a second, is the fact that 80% of it is dark. It's unstructured data, right? So you have structured data in your project plans, or you have data coming from machines, et cetera. But more than 80% of it is dark data, right? So there's volumes of data, and there's oodles of dark data as well in that. So the essence of what we said is we will respond to this market shift, this was several years ago, by focusing on data and systems that can deal with volumes of data, fundamentally from the point of view that we believe systems to deal with this data can no longer be the programmed variety. They must be cognitive systems, is the term we use, which is a phrase that encapsulates machine learning and artificial intelligence. And the point being that we will need systems that can understand, reason, and learn to be able to respond to and take advantage of all the data. And the data could include sound, images, video, right? Unstructured data in text, your diagrams, engineering drawings, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a key trend that we invested in from the point of view of every aspect of our business. The impact of that we've seen extensive impacts of that as we started to take what we branded as Watson is the technology that is the foundation, and it's named after one of our early CEOs, and not after Sherlock Holmes' sidekick, as some people also believe. And then said, of course, in 2011, some of you may have seen it, played Jeopardy, won against two top players at that point. And that was, of course, it was not intended to be a game-playing system. The first application of it was on oncology, and we've been pretty successful with that. About 45 hospitals after the first 2 or 3 are starting to use it. And the idea is we're now aiding decision support, right, by professionals and experts in those industries to be able to deal with the vast amounts of data that becomes available. And then we've gone to a variety of industries to apply that. One great example of that is an oil and gas company that uses it to essentially has created corpuses of information across their different domains, EHS, projects, maintenance, et cetera, to be able to query in natural language a question saying, where have we done this before? Is the essence of the question, right? Lessons learned. Where have I learned something before that I can replicate? Free up that information from people's heads, documents, et cetera, to make it available. And they've been very successful in moving the productivity from the expert perspective, right, or in order to be able to make the right decision. We are starting to see the trend now in engineering construction to leverage these kinds of technologies and other technologies, right? At the end of the day, the technologies are available. It's what each industry does with it is really the question, right? The business problems are there, the technology is there. Now the marrying of the two has to occur, right? So in engineering construction, we're starting to see trends such as taking structured and unstructured data to address and predict how projects will perform early on. So early project health, not only based on the fact that there's data in a project plan, but there's also data in materials management systems. It is the profile of the project manager. Does the project manager have so to speak, an optimistic profile, right, versus a realistic profile versus a pessimistic profile? The red, yellow, green then have different points of view based on that. So that's been a very successful project for for one of the engineering construction companies. We're starting to see a couple of other engineering construction companies saying, I get these RFPs, there's vast amounts of data in it, there's lots of risks that are hidden in it. We capture several of them, but we don't necessarily have the institutional memory, back to my oil and gas example, to be able to learn effectively and predict risk from it, right? And sort of develop a point of view. So we're developing a system with 3 engineering construction companies that helps them analyze the RFPs and account for the risks. But again, we support the advice to the folks responding, because we believe as yet the technology is not there to substitute and replace anybody, any expert today, right? Essentially to be able to bring together data that's present in the environment and in these companies, but not necessarily made available. But at the end, but we sort of come back to compared, and then, I'm sorry, just one quick other point on engineering construction. Lots of conversations and movement on platforms, industry platforms, right? You mentioned lots of pieces of technology coming through, but then engineering construction companies looking at platforms to bring together various, there's been a lot of conversation and collaboration across disciplines. I believe there has to be a lot more focus in the engineering construction industry around collaboration across the ecosystem, not just within an enterprise, compared to manufacturing, mining, et cetera. And I'm not talking about banking and such like industries. There was a conversation on investment banking, et cetera, which theoretically have far more money to invest in technology. I'm talking about classical industrial companies that have tight margins to be able to do what they do. But they're investing significantly in collaborating with the ecosystem, creating platforms to transform, right? And we're seeing examples of that. But seeing some of the early signs, and we all know that fast followers and sort of early adopters together transform the industry. I do believe there's hope, but the pace at which manufacturing and resources industries are moving, i.e. Most of the clients for this sort of group is much faster than the engineering construction industry at large. Mm-hmm. So I think that should be perhaps sort of the essence of what we focus on, is how do we move faster? The technology is there, we have examples, and how do we drive productivity? How do we drive new sources of revenue? How do we drive sustainability, right? There are many, many concerns. How do we attract talent to the industry, and so on?
Yeah, that's a really great point, that whole technology adoption curve, the laggards versus the early adopters. So right. We'll touch on that. Great. Greg?
Well, Gretchen, of course, fascinating conversation already today. I really appreciate being invited. Stephen already blew my cover. I'm kind of a financial engineer by background. The other 4 co-founding brothers at Bentley Systems are all legitimate engineers, and of course all we do is software for advancing infrastructure from its design modeling, construction modeling, and asset performance stage. So we're invested in exactly the opportunities we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. And I think the glass is largely half full for us. When we look at the words innovate, disrupt, and transform, digital is not always in front of those words, but I think we've been emphasizing how digital opportunities can help our construction industry in commercial opportunities. I know we'll get to more specifics about that. But when we say going digital, I think it's worth remembering, what do we mean by digital? And in construction, we would say, well, it's characterized by not having paper. Well, why do we not have paper? It's because when information is in a digital format, and especially if it can describe itself, and that is an innovation from software technologies that can now be taken for granted. The internet has made that a matter of course, that information can describe itself so it can be queried and found. The opportunity is that engineering information has been in the 80% dark part that Manish described before, and now we have the opportunity to light it up and create opportunities for all of us. So going digital would bring benefits when information can be used for purposes beyond which were contemplated when it was created. Right. And when we're talking about infrastructure and long-lived facilities, the opportunity for the digital engineering models by which we intelligently create all of the engineering value, for that to become the digital DNA to be leveraged during the operations and maintenance, the TODEX lifecycle, is a huge opportunity. It can't happen if in construction we don't enliven and enrich the digital engineering models to be the construction models. So that's the crux of it occurs. The crux of the overall opportunity occurs in construction, where we could deaden and kill and keep dark the engineering data, or use it to improve our construction processes and have it be available to be the digital DNA in asset performance. So when I think of Stephen's description of the opportunities he sees ahead with flattening the supply chain, I'd call that a connected data environment to enable that across the supply chain, and stretching the dollars for digital twins that are alive through TODEX to capture that opportunity, and then shrinking for agility is about productizing what we do. Something that characterizes all of those, I would say it's about industrializing what we do in projects and infrastructure. Industrializing would mean applying industrial processes in all of the ways that he described. And what strikes me is the research efforts at CII have already been advancing that opportunity. So we do a lot with advanced work packaging. And advanced work packaging, from engineering work packages to construction work packages to installation work packages, that provides the foundation prerequisite, if you like, for the information flow that has to accompany material flow if we're industrializing for this larger opportunity. And the CII and the research teams, it's this secret sauce that somehow has enabled this cooperation that created the prescription to make that possible. And the innovations we now need are how to apply that prescription. And they need to be innovations on the people and process side, because of this huge advancement gap between the best of our projects and the norm of our projects. That adds up to this opportunity that McKinsey has quantified for construction to finally catch up in the productivity tables. And the provocative way they've measured that the whole infrastructure investment gap in the world could be closed if we would only catch up in productivity in capital projects to make the projects bankable. So I am really very encouraged that we have such a digital opportunity ahead of us, and I couldn't have imagined that at CII the opportunity would be focused on the business opportunity. We need to become, in industrializing our BIM, in industrializing our processes, we need to become, in engineering and construction, proprietors of facilities. We need to be merchant engineers and capture that value. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that throughout the panel. I want to leave with this introductory remark with some encouragement, because we know that advanced work packaging, while it's been substantiated to bring such gains in productivity and tool time and performance factors and so forth, and owners are beginning to acknowledge and measure and require it and move the industry forward. But we're mainly in that lagging stage, which emphasizes the opportunity ahead. But I'll just mention that, for instance, in the realm of heavy civil construction, innovations that begin with what we call reality modeling, so that the work of surveyors and engineers is continuous throughout the project and automation occurs, is already here. So where before a roadway project begins, drones from photography use software to process a reality mesh, which is engineering ready. The designers with our software begin with that reality mesh, so they're always contemplating the existing conditions. During construction, the drones regularly fly again, produce a different reality mesh, and the engineering software is again done to compute the cut and fill, to determine the economic status of the project and pay the parties. And then the automation in the form of the machine-controlled grading is customary now, closing that industrialization loop opportunity. And then the positioning systems report back the as-built, and then the paving and milling can smooth out the road, not just remove equal quantities and so forth. And then the whole thing repeats again. So there are examples where industrialization, closing that circle, where the information moves through cloud services in the same way that the material moves, that is substantiated to happen in some of our endeavors in infrastructure. And there are very large opportunities to close this advancement gap. We need to be innovative also on the people and process side to make these technologies the norm.
Yep, definitely. And you've referenced Filipe's report from February, I believe, identifying the productivity gap in the construction industry. It's a great report if you all haven't seen that. And it's interesting moderating this panel. If you get a business card from myself or Kelsey or Mona or one of our other consultants, and you look at the back of it, our vision is to transform the construction industry through revolutionary innovation. And it's that revolutionary that kind of scares people, but that's kind of what we're talking about here is revolutionary thinking about our industry and how we improve our industry. So I'm going to start a question with Steve, and we're going to have a conversation about this. When you see those words, when you see innovate, disrupt, transform, what does that really translate to for your thinking as a CEO and your business?
Well, my view is it's both a risk and an opportunity, and while I'm mindful of the risk, I'm most excited about the opportunity. And I believe, we're well situated to take advantage of those opportunities. And if you think about the three words, in my view, in terms of opportunity, the most important word then is innovation, because if we are able to innovate, we may disrupt someone else, but we won't be disrupted. We may land on something that's so innovative that we transform something. But we spend a lot of time on innovation to make sure that we're staying ahead of the curve, that we're not lagging the industry, that we're in fact out trying to do things that others are not, again with these kind of small bets and small experiments, so we don't risk the whole company when we do it. But for us, it needs to be part of who we are and how we do business, otherwise we'll end up being disrupted. So we've developed within the company a number of things that we think help us move towards that goal, and one of the places we had to work on was the culture of the company, deeply rooted in the Midwest, deeply rooted in big, large projects, deeply rooted in here's the way we do it, this is the Black and Veatch way. When people would come in and say, what about this? No, this is the Black and Veatch way. But a lot of this has to do with making sure that everyone understands that they have permission to do these things and open up their minds to try these smaller experiments and make sure that they're learning from those. And as we've done that, then we've created a growth accelerator to be up on the side, and it is not built into the businesses, it's off on the edge. It reports directly to me, and they take on the more far-reaching kinds of transformative innovations that we're pursuing today. And I think what we've learned is that when we run some of those areas through the business units, then issues you run across are funding gets cut whenever there's an issue at a business. They always have a different priority, maybe a project they want to chase and invest in versus staying with innovation and making sure that they are moving forward with innovation. So those areas that we work on could be cost efficiencies, incremental improvements, transformative innovation, or whole new market segments and solutions. Any of those, I feel like all of those fall into the innovation bucket. It doesn't mean it's technology driven. Sometimes it is, other times it's more about business model innovation. And I think if you look at the canvas of what's occurred over the last 5 years, let's say, there's been a lot of technology impacted companies that have disrupted the industries, but there's been an equal number that have had tremendous innovation in the business models. So you have to constantly be working all all angles on the innovation side to be successful.
Yeah, Manish, you brought up a point about the adoption and being early adopters. What do you all think when you listen to Steve talk about innovating in a 103-year-old company that is the 12th largest employee-owned company in the U.S.? So I'm sure that brings another interesting dynamic, the fact that you're employee-owned, about our ability to move quickly when it comes to innovation, and those words up there: innovate, disrupt, transform.
So I think the quick part, so Steve also made the point around sort of moving quickly and failing fast, right? So if you look at the mindset that is needed in the world around innovation, around digital and technology, it's really very different from the mindset of, sort of a waterfall model. The old days of technology were, you developed the requirements and you sequentially then designed it, then you move to the development, et cetera. So, all of you would have heard about Agile, right? So those principles then have to, get imbibed into the culture of the company, right? So have innovation hubs, and they don't have to be just around the kind of technology I'm talking about. It could be all kinds of technology, including robotics, et cetera, right? But the idea fundamentally is develop several ideas, right? Channel quickly to the ones you're going to experiment quickly with it, develop what we now call MVPs, minimum viable products, right? Not do POCs, which are still in the conference room, but actually go and test them in real life in some controlled manner, right? And come back and see, which ones proceed and which ones don't. But the think big, fail fast is a key cultural change. The other key element of that is so we've adopted, as have several other companies, a theme of design thinking, right? Came from Stanford School. We've created our own version, IBM Design Thinking. We've created design studios, et cetera. So all that, the word design aside, but the essence of it is we start with the customer requirements in mind, the end customer, right? So of course you can look sequentially at the engineering construction chain, but if you go forward to the individual that's going to reside in the building you this thing, or the road user, right? And you start from there. And of course, then you can peel back the road operator and so on and so forth. So that's the other part of it. The innovation engine requires a focus on the entire customer chain, starting with the end customer in mind, right? So that's the essence of design thinking, and then working backwards to what are the innovations needed. So I think those are two things. And the third and last thing I'd mention is there is a fundamental cultural shift that is needed, right? Or people shift that is needed. And this is clearly about, and we're seeing it even in our company, right? As we are undergoing several transformation waves ourselves, right? So you take the mention of Amazon disrupting retail. Amazon is disrupting our industry as well, right? Significantly.
Right.
So what we've seen is and I'm using a rough number, at least from an IBM perspective, we are driving talent in, right? Lots of fresh young millennial minds, more digitally savvy, et cetera. We're also training our folks significantly, changing our work environments, right? So creating a cultural transformation. Some people in our company have adopted that mindset, right? The new mindset that is required. And others have not. So I think that's really where you've got to be able to imbibe new ways of working, new environments, and then decide, I hate to be brutal in some sense, but decide who's going to be able to transform and who's not.
Right. Greg, you had...
Well, I feel somewhat authorized, as it were, in talking to construction about disruption and transformation, because the software industry has gone through disruption and transformation. So back when the business cycle was all going in one direction, we thought we were a perpetual growth business software. But then the economy turned down, and it just became clear we were a very cyclical organization industry, because we sold new licenses new perpetual licenses of software. So we only had more business when the second derivative, if you like, was in the right direction. But we knew we were continuing to add more value with the software we had already provided. So the shift to software as a service can be thought about as having to do with technologies like cloud services, but really is more about charging for outcomes and results. And our industry has been improved. We used to, when we sold software licenses, we immediately transferred all the risk to you in terms of obsolescence and fit for purpose and so forth. And we were arguably done. I'm not talking about our company, of course. But in effect, that sounds a bit like what construction does now. And if instead we would say, actually, as a service, we want to work under a service level agreement where our opportunity depends on the value you generate. We'll have a service level agreement with you where we measure outcomes and are paid for improvements in outcomes. We're interested in that because we're a believer in going digital and what it can accomplish, and you see the virtue of that yourself. The particulars, the way in which that's relevant perhaps for what we do at CII is in our software for construction simulation and workplace planning. We're willing to adapt our business model to be paid instead per individual work package when it goes through QA and QC, and to share in the performance factor bonus that we hope the owner will offer the supply chain at large, including the technology portfolio provider on a project. We're eager to get into that type of model. And the reason that that's relevant for this notion of the culture, so when we have a innovator such as Black & Veatch is really unique in having a recurring R&D commitment in its company. It's very rare among companies here in doing that.
Right.
But when you innovate on one project, how do you institutionalize and replicate and productize what you've learned across the rest of the projects? That's the people and process part of it. That becomes our problem too if we're a supplier providing software to enable that innovation. We need to be compensated for helping. We call it a success plan. We think we need to embed our own people into Black & Veatch to help that be propagated and become standardized. We can't stop with we created the technology. We need to be rewarded only when the technology delivers value.
Yep.
Now, finally, is that something we can say, hearing Steve's message about capital facilities? The capital facilities wouldn't be only a transaction, but we can have a stake in their TODEX performance on the engineering and contracting side, part of a new commercial formulation that would follow suit, where your own firms might work under a service level agreement against owners' requirements. Just interesting and provocative to think about. But that's the purpose of the morning, I guess.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Stephen mentioned the study we did, order takers or value creators, and that value proposition really starts inside an owner business, the customer that you all are serving, whether you're Procter & Gamble or General Motors and you're an engineering construction facilities group. How are we thinking like business people? How are we providing value? Both of you mentioned culture, and it's very interesting. I did a CEO study on agility, and culture came up within 5 minutes of every conversation I've had with a CEO about agility. And Stephen, you said we need to think like business people, not engineers. Edgar Schein, who's one of the leading experts on culture, recently has been putting forward some things about occupational culture. If you Google Edgar Schein on YouTube, you can see him talking about it. And it really struck me as an engineer that we do kind of have an industry culture and an occupational culture at times because risk is driven out of us in engineering school. So it's interesting that you would bring up culture. How do we address culturally within our organizations and our industry our ability to disrupt and be revolutionary? Filipe?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when we look at any transformation, and especially when we look at technology transformations, we say it's kind of three things, right? You have to change your management system. So how you measure people, how you configure the business, how you incent people has to change. You obviously have to change the technical system, processes, and so forth. But you also have to change the mindset and capabilities of people, and a culture is one element of that, right? If you don't do those three, you never get a sustainable transformation, right? So often when we see clients really struggling is they're focusing all on the technical system. It's all about the process or just about AWP or just about, you know, production planning or whatever it is. Or the other way around, it's only about culture, right? So I think the first message you have to do all three. But in any transformation, when you look at failures, you know, often culture and organizational aspects are the single largest cause of failures of transformation. So it's fundamental. And the challenge for us is if you're going to transform your business or a particular project and so forth, you have so many different layers to deal with, right? So when we do a transformation, you have to start at the top. So, for instance, if you're doing a digital manufacturing or digital construction transformation, you need to have the CEO lead it. You need to have the executives go, to an experience for a few days. Is this real? Is it real out there, and is it real for my context? But you then also need to do it at mid-level management, and you need to do it at the front line, right? So I think cultural transformations is fundamental. It spans tops to bottom, and it's not straightforward, right? So it's got to be very considered and programmatic.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, and I think, so totally agree on the leadership element of driving culture. I think the other thought would be the experimentation and agility, et cetera, right? So the engineering culture, and just to clarify, I don't just have an MBA, I'm also an engineer. So hence I speak from the point of view of the engineering culture fundamentally is about precision and perfection, right? Mm-hmm. So that's, if I sort of oversimplify the way that we have to operate when you're building something or manufacturing something, et cetera. The culture of experimentation is a foreign idea, right? And imprecise, imperfect, minimum viable products. So another way that we've done it is hire a bunch of diverse people, right? So we've now built what at one time was the world's largest digital agency, essentially advertising, creating creative folks. Now perhaps is the second largest. But these folks and the way they think and operate are so dramatically different from, now if you go back 50, 60 years, the classical image of IBM was whatever, dark suits and white shirts, right? And now we have to do these kinds of socks. Now, but socks aside, the way we've really tried to create a different culture, right, in our company is creating a very diverse mix, right? So apart from, of course, being led by our CEO, as you said, in every company, every client company that I've dealt with is also the same. So I think creating diversity in the talent pool, knowing where you want to go, not perhaps in the core business, how you want to impact and influence the core business, I think is also an interesting dimension to consider.
And maybe just to make it practical for our industry, just to be provocative, maybe 3 mindset changes and culture changes we have to make. So, we know we're one of the least digitized industries out there. I think only agriculture and hunting is lower than us. We know we spend a lower % on R&D and IT than almost any other sector. And we, on the other hand, there's $1 trillion opportunity there, and our research says at least a third of it is technology-led. So we're looking at $300 billion and over $100 billion just in the US. So you have this massive opportunity and this massive underinvestment. So what are the mindsets and the cultures that underlie it, right? When we did our survey on about 200-300 folks for the construction productivity, I think technology was only 7th. So although we see some organizations and some CEOs saying this is a big deal, it's my top priority, others are starting to move. As an industry, we don't yet believe it.
Right.
So that's number one, right? So, and we see it then come out. We have, poor outcomes, we have underinvestment, but yet as an industry, we don't yet believe that this is one of the most important topics for us. So, that's one thing we're going to have to address. And again, it starts at the C-suite, but it also to the project manager, the guy or girl out there, right, who's been doing it the same way for 20 years. How do you transform them, right? So I'd say that's, a very big one. The next one is, Stephen put it as, we have to think like business people, right? And so my biggest nightmare is when a client is starting to do a transformation and you see kind of a 3-year IT project. Of course, that's a big deal, but you have to start with what's the business case. And it's got to be believable, it's got to be implementable, it's got to be real, right? If you can't transform your business system, and there's not real money there, then you don't go and do it, right? And there's so many things and, cultural norms in our industry that prevent that, right? We have, most of the time, this awful transactional behavior between owners and contractors, kind of 3 bids and a buy, which doesn't lead to the right outcome. We don't share data that much. You look at other industries, the tech industry, you have fierce competitors sharing components and data, right? Apple buying Samsung screens and chips, right? So we don't do that. And at the heart of it, we have to think, especially on the construction side, we often go into projects, with a bid that we know on paper is not going to make money, and we're going to make the money through change orders and so on, which actually, how that happens is through lack of transparency, right? So we have to change our mindset and say, no, maybe we can flip it around, right? Fundamentally, we'll make money a different way, right? And we'll make it through transparency and through meeting joint business objectives. So I do think there's some major cultural changes that we have to make in our industry, and it's not straightforward.
Yeah, you bring up two really interesting points: funding R&D and transparency of data. Steve, were you going to say something?
I was just going to add on the cultural aspect. We've been focused on that at Black & Veatch for about 3 years. Mm-hmm. And it's one of my priorities. It is something that whenever I'm with our professionals, it's something that I talk about and tie back to our program where we're driving culture. As we looked at ourselves about 3 years ago, we talked about where we were and where we wanted to be. Mm. And a lot of the things we saw that were holding us back from getting where we wanted to be were cultural related. So we've invested a lot in culture. I spend a fair amount of my time on that and messaging. Whenever I'm with our professionals, I make it a point to talk about that as much as I talk about safety or business results. Mm. And it did have to start at the top, and then we went through, multiple layers through leadership. But I think what we really found was we had to reach into all areas of the company. We had to engage everybody, side to side and top to bottom across the organization. So we found ways to communicate to them where we wanted to be and what we needed to do to change our culture. And then we've had, at all levels throughout the company, various leadership levels, working with small groups and talking to their peers and others that they can gather up about the principles we use to adjust our culture, how we're going to move where we want to be. And it's made a difference in our ability to move forward with innovation. I think without adding the culture piece, I think innovation would not be possible.
Yeah, and that culture eats strategy for breakfast quote that Peter Drucker, everybody argues over who said that, but and you should talk about it. It's a 3-year effort, and you're not done. It's a long journey. No. Simon Sinek, the great TED Talk on Start With Why, explaining to people why. Why did you talk to people? Why do we need to change our culture? What was the business case for it?
Our business case was although 12th largest employee-owned company, we had desires to be larger. I think someone mentioned here, it's either get bigger in this industry or fade away. I'm not certain of that personally, but that's a risk that we need to worry about. And we had desires to grow the company, and some of the things we were doing were getting in the way of growing. Mm. And as we looked at all of those areas, it kept coming back to culture. Mm. And so fairly quickly in my tenure, walking in, I knew we had something with culture, but it's not, CEO stands up the first day and says, we're going to fix our culture, is not what everyone wants to hear, right?
Right.
So we built it around the growth theme and transforming the company, and to do that, culture needed to adjust to enable us to achieve that business case.
Great. Greg mentioned your significant investment in R&D, and I want to ask the rest of you. We regularly underinvest in R&D as an industry and as organizations in an industry. Why is that, and what, even better, what can we do about that? How do we invest more in R&D as an industry?
Well, maybe it actually has to do with this culture. And if the culture in capital projects is strictly a project culture, and we invent a solution for each project individually, then the returns to R&D aren't there at the scale they would be if we would instead have productization in mind. What would be proprietary in terms of our product notion? And if we had that more in mind, and I'm not talking about writing software, but having innovative applications of what we do, if we always would want to reward behavior that improves other projects and all projects, then maybe we would have higher returns on investment in R&D in engineering and contracting organizations.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I think that there's a lot of cross lessons, right, that need to be captured from project to project. In the construction industry, classically, the only way I've seen productivity driven, and when I did real work about 20 years ago, I was working actively with Air Products. So while they appear like an industrial gases company, as Stephen was saying, they're really at heart an engineering construction company, because the process or the gas or the chemical they're trying to produce is pretty much coming out once they've laid out the facility. They did a big focus on productization and creating what I would call modular and repeatable capabilities. And I think that really led to them saying, okay, how do I now take this component of or this module and improve it? How do I take this process of final assembly at the site? It's also a point made yesterday, reduce the number of hours at the job site, right? So they invested a lot of money there based on the productization and componentization of their entire endpoint, which is setting up the air separation facility or the the H2CO facilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the other challenges in this industry is, for some firms that have to innovate, their customers don't choose what the end product looks like, right? They choose their wallets, but ultimately they don't start at the beginning and saying, my iPhone needs to be this big and have this functionality. The company designs it. I think in our industry, the owner, the engineer, the contractor all input on that, right? Often the owner will say, I want my hospital beds to look like this, and my cost per, or an oil and gas company will say, this is the scale I want this different technology, and so forth. So I think to solve the R&D problem, it's across the industry value chain, right? And so if you're really going to crack it, I think you're going to have to see a lot more strategic partnerships emerge between major owners and certain contractors.
Right.
Because the data, the technology, the design, and so on, flows across those. So I think that'll be one of the challenges we have, is how do we create, cross-value chain collaboration. And, Stephen mentioned with Boeing, right? Boeing will design on paper a plane, they'll go and sell it, and then they'll figure out how they're going to build it and scale it over, decades to actually meet that price. And because of that, they'll have their suppliers involved right up front in design. But if there's problems, they'll put their own teams and their suppliers to fix problems, right? And so I think, how we collaborate across the value chain will be critical if we really want to up R&D and investments.
Yeah, it's a really
and I think just sort of to build on that point, I think back to so I think the engineering construction industry has operated more on hours-based approach as the industry moves more towards turnkey outcomes-based. This is the outcome that the client is looking for. Right? There are lots more contracts coming up in that way. I think that naturally creates an impetus to not make hours the currency, hours times X, right, be the currency. It transforms it to be, okay, how do I do it for that much lesser, right? So I know in our industry, of course, we do that a lot, but I think in the engineering construction industry, as the market, it's ripe. Stephen said in terms of, or was I think perhaps said yesterday, in terms of just the amount of delay, right? It's an embarrassment, amount of significant overruns, et cetera. So I think the outcome push from the owner-operators will be the second factor that will cause, just like in manufacturing, right? You take the electronic supply chain, you take the automotive supply chain. It's all about saying, my outcome is X, I want to push it down. Retail, groceries, everything is the same, right? So I think that's where also a big push has to come from the owner-operator contracting with the EPCs in a different manner. And that trend has already started, right? It's not a new idea, but that'll increase the focus on productivity by the EPC companies. And then I think moving a step back to the ecosystem point, it's also then the EPC companies collaborating. So the outcome-based is one part. The other part is creating collaboration. So I think collaboration with either equipment suppliers or who are already making their equipment smart, right? You mentioned Caterpillar earlier, Komatsu has the same, right? And so on and so forth. Now, how do I use what the suppliers are doing or work with them to innovate what they do to transform how I'm operating? You collaborate with the robotics company, right, to do that.
Well, and it's interesting because a couple of you brought up transparency of data. We may be one of the last industries that has very little transparency in data. And I'd love it if you could comment on that. And how do we get to the point where we are sharing information and everybody doesn't feel like I need to have my information about a project or a program?
So I think Stephen made the case well for what I'll call a common data environment on a project, like the 787 project for Boeing. And in our discussions with owner-operators, as they realize that the more secure and that their engineering data is best made light, rather than being in opaque blobs, if it can become searchable and filterable and so forth, that's done through a cloud service. So the cloud service makes this technically feasible to have this connected data environment more so than ever. And I believe owners that we're speaking to are very close to mandating what I'll call a transparent data environment across a project. Now, I want to distinguish this from the notion that there isn't intellectual property and it should be available for all. I believe that's a red herring. We should be talking about transparent data within a project. And I think yesterday there were discussions of various strategies for integrated project delivery. The information, the connected data environment can provide alternatives for integrated project delivery to occur without monolithic firms providing it. And everyone should see the incentive and opportunities there in having project information be transparent. But the basis of the project information should be this notion of intelligent components. That's where the industrialization starts. So Filipe, in your research, you indicated that in surveying capital projects, that under half of projects start with prescribed catalogs of components. In other words, the other half all start with a blank slate, and it's R&D from the ground up every time. Owners should have their prescribed and preferred, their reliability-driven preference for intelligent components. And the design modeling should start from that palette, if you like. The components, intelligent components, can know their fabrication strategies. This can be contributed by the suppliers, as Stephen was describing in the manufacturing side. But the components understand their construction strategies, and they begin to accumulate their reliability histories. They know their failure modes and effects, and ultimately they accumulate experience through what we would now call the Internet of Things to become reliability informed for purposes of design modeling again. That's now feasible technically. So that's one of the advantages of this transparent connected data environment, to enable that and make it the norm. So much to be gained just from that. And then in terms of when there's transparency, there's visibility to the owner. So if with industrialization, global sourcing is such an opportunity, as Boeing found, then you no longer have, if things are being globally sourced in a modular basis, you no longer have a physical path of visibility into the construction site because it's being done everywhere. That needs to be virtual visibility, which the transparent connected data environment can provide on a project. And then last of all, this notion that that data itself is valuable. So here is where, for instance, in the example of using advanced work packaging, from engineering work packages to construction work packages to installation work packages, IPA has worked with us to establish how, rather than merely doing postmortems to compare and benchmark projects after they're done and there's an outcome achieved, what of course we want is to have real-time indications of whether projects are going off course or on course or otherwise. And here they have now, their data scientists have created big data analytics to look at the work package traffic and so forth to determine, for instance, is construction readiness achieved and so forth. And then you could imagine using big data analytics within your own firms to say, look at the audit trails of information, the indications of information quality having to do with who accessed what information when, and was it the right information, and how often has this been updated or not. There could be patterns that you could envision using Watson or other technologies to say, what's the project dashboard on the basis of the information quality, where we don't need a hypothesis. We can simply apply the patterns that we've learned from the past. So transparency has so much to gain, but we shouldn't confuse it and oppose it on the basis of loss of intellectual property, because I assure you that in the 787, no one commingled their intellectual property, and yet they managed to have a better outcome and the savings that Stephen described. It increases intellectual property and the proprietariness of the engineering and construction industry to have transparent data in the way that is technically possible now.
Filipe?
I think just one important thing is we've spoken a lot about barriers and so on, but ultimately, I think if we kind of go forward and look back on the industry in 10 years, I think all the signs say, there will be a lot of transformation, a lot of change. And I think the signposts we see is, first of all, no industry has avoided it, right? So it's going to happen. If we see where the money is flowing, it is changing, right? I spoke about, $10 billion of startup capital for construction tech firms, but it's accelerating. So the last point of data we got just for VC funds, not the other source of funds, in 2015 it was $400 million. The year before it was 100, so times 4 in 1 year. And then you look at whole industries and governments saying we've got to change, right? You look at UK and Singapore governments saying we're going to mandate BIM, at least some form of BIM. At some stage the US with its infrastructure gap is going to start mandating large changes. We see whole industries who can't build projects now, if you look at a lot of the commodity industries, at a competitive cost. So when we look at all these factors, and then just the sheer pace of change in robotics, in machine learning, so ultimately it's going to change. I think our value chain is complex enough that a lot of the end change will live within us. So I think it's more about winners and losers, and it's for us to start challenging ourselves. Where's the value? How do we transform our business system and change a lot of these cultural norms? And then, innovate thoughtfully across the enterprise, but also, rapidly. And so.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And Greg, your point about owners driving transparency, it reminds me of safety and the role that CII played in driving safety, and owners putting their foot down and saying, you're not going to do work for us if your safety record isn't this. You're not going to do work for us if we're not engaging in transparent information, and that need to be revolutionary. And as you said, Filipe, it's going to happen to us as an industry. Yeah. I have one last question, and then we're going to go to questions in the audience. So if you want to start lining up at the microphones, if you have a question. I've read a couple of great books recently outside of our industry, and I think sometimes we don't look enough outside our industry for lessons that we can leverage and bring into our industry. One was The Patient Will See You Now by Eric Topol, about disruption, and Thank You for Being Late is another great book, Thomas Friedman. And I actually read another one on the plane, Lead and Disrupt by O'Reilly and Tushman from Harvard and Stanford. What are you guys, just real quickly, what's your favorite book right now that you're reading or have read that applies to disruption innovation? Anybody want to share their reading list?
I wouldn't yet put it in my favorites, but I'm reading Innovation Prowess, which was by one of the Wharton professors.
Innovation Prowess.
Innovation Prowess.
Great. Filipe?
I think there's a book called Sapiens, The History of Humankind, and you see how, if you take a longer perspective, how change and how we are just developing radically, right? And we're sitting at the front end of that now. And I think it's useful sometimes to take the longer perspective.
The History of Humankind, great. Manish?
Yeah, I think, so books and what's being written now, I'd say some of the case studies in terms of, the industrial world is transforming. I think those become very relevant lessons for us, not just outside. So how, for example, a GE, et cetera, are transforming to go from an old industrial company to a digital industrial company. And I think that's what the engineering construction industry has to think about. You take the GE model or you take the ABB Siemens model, both are valid. GE said we will build our own capability, and ABB Siemens are partnering with companies like ourselves to essentially transform themselves from the old industrial to the new industrial. So I think those cases are very interesting stories, not just the Ubers and so on.
Great. Greg?
Well, it's tough to get me to read a business book, so when I saw one that was called Messy, The Power of Disorder to Transform Our Lives, I think it's by Tom Harford. I recommend it because he makes the point that don't judge someone by how neat their desk is or not. Don't judge a team by whether everything is in perfect harmony. It's out of disharmony and so forth that messy as it might be, results get sometimes best achieved.
Yeah, and that's a great ending point, and we're actually not going to have live questions. I realize now that we're doing the questions through the app, and they will be forwarded to the panel, and we will get answers back to people. But I think that's a really great ending point because what I would add on to Stephen, having been in the industry since 1994, things may get messy through some of this transformation. I'm sure at times the change in culture has been messy at
Absolutely.
Black & Veatch, and when you're putting out reports that report on $1 trillion opportunity, the excitement is that it's going to get messy, but there's so much opportunity for us to improve and transform the way we think as an industry. So I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their time. And it's really been a great discussion. I hope the audience has gotten a lot out of it. And I think they're going to be around for a while if people have questions and would like to come up to them. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.